Their meeting at the abandoned lighthouse marked the beginning of a journey where love, pain, and the secrets of the past intertwined into one fateful knot. Sophia had always believed that love came unexpectedly, but she never imagined she would find it at the edge of the world. She stood on an abandoned lighthouse, high above the raging ocean when she first saw him. Trevor. Tall, lean yet strong, he looked like a man accustomed to wandering. His dark hair, tousled slightly by the wind, fell over his forehead, giving him a careless yet mysterious look. His features were sharp and slightly gaunt, as if shadows of old memories had left their mark on him. His eyes, deep dark gray cold, held something elusive, as if he carried a secret too heavy to share. The wind tugged at her clothes, the rain lashed against her face, but his gaze remained clear and piercing, as though he knew exactly why she was there. "Do you come here often?" he asked, stepping closer. "First time," Sophia replied, trying to suppress the tremor in her voice. "It's easy to get lost here." His voice was deep and calm. "But sometimes that's exactly what we need." His gaze pierced through her, and she felt a shiver, not from the cold but from a sense of foreboding. There was something uncannily familiar about him, as if they had met before in another life. His eyes bore the weariness of someone who had seen too much, lost too much. A moment stretched into eternity before Trevor turned away and stepped closer to the edge of the lighthouse, where the waves raged below. Instinctively, Sophia moved forward, afraid he might fall into the abyss. "Do you live here?" Her voice was quieter than she had intended. "More like I exist here," he answered with a grim smirk. "This place, it's like a magnet. It draws in those who have already lost their way home." Her heart clenched. Was this a warning? Or a confession? The rain intensified, droplets sliding from her lashes, mixing with the salty air. Sophia never took her eyes off him. She didn't know why it was so important to stay to ask to understand. Maybe because for the first time in a long while she felt something real. "Why do I feel like I should know you?" she suddenly asked. Trevor looked at her with a long, studying gaze. The wind tousled his hair, making him look like a ghost trapped between worlds. "Maybe you already do," he said. "You just don't remember." His words struck something deep inside her, awakening a strange sense of déjà vu. Sophia took a step back, feeling a shiver run through her body. "Don't be afraid," he continued, his voice softer now. "Sometimes we need to be lost to find what truly matters." The next morning, Sophia woke up with the feeling that her mind and heart were caught between the past and the present. Trevor's image resurfaced in her thoughts, his voice echoing in her mind, repeating those enigmatic words. She tried to focus on her daily routine, but it was futile. He had infiltrated her consciousness, leaving behind a lingering unease and an eerie sense of anticipation. Every look, every movement, even the way he stood at the edge of the lighthouse, seemed to hold a hidden meaning. Sophia felt a connection between them, invisible but tangible. Was it mere coincidence, or had fate played its hand? She didn't know, but deep inside, she felt that this encounter was no accident. Throughout the day, she caught herself gazing toward the horizon, where the waves crashed endlessly. Her thoughts kept circling back to what he had said. "Maybe you already know, you just don't remember." The words wouldn't let her go. Could it be possible that they had met before? Or was it something greater beyond logic and time? That evening, they met in a small bar on the outskirts of the port. Conversations about life, loss, and dreams filled the space between them. The bar's atmosphere, thick with cigarette smoke and dim lighting, created a sense of coziness and mystery. A soft jazz melody played quietly from behind the counter, blending with the hushed voices of the patrons. Here, everyone was someone else for a night, hiding behind half-empty glasses and stolen glances. Sophia watched Trevor, noting how his fingers absently tapped against his whiskey glass, as if trying to drown out restless thoughts. There was something broken in him, yet he didn't try to hide it. Instead, he carried his pain like an inseparable part of himself. "Why are you here?" Sophia asked, leaning in slightly. Her voice was soft, but there was insistence in it. Trevor slowly lifted his gaze to her, and for a moment, something like longing flickered in his eyes. "I'm running," he murmured, so quietly she barely caught the words, but their meaning was unmistakable. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. From what? Trevor let out a bitter chuckle and took a sip. The past, he finally admitted, his voice hollow as if the words cost him something. He swirled his glass, watching the amber liquid slide along the walls. From those who are gone. And from myself. Sophia frowned slightly, her fingers tightening around her glass. From yourself? She echoed, her gaze searching his. Is that even possible? Trevor smirked, but there was no amusement in it. If you run long enough, maybe you just dissolve, he replied. Become a shadow. Or an echo. Something inside her shifted. There was something eerily familiar in his words. I'm running too, she confessed, clenching her hands as if it somehow mattered. But I'm not sure from what. Just this feeling. That if I stop, something will catch up to me. Something I'm afraid of. Trevor lifted his gaze again, his gray eyes filled with unspeakable weariness. And do you think running ever ends? He asked quietly. Sophia sighed and took a sip before answering. I don't know, she whispered, staring into her drink. But sometimes I think running isn't about escaping. It's just a way to stop feeling. Trevor squinted slightly, his fingers freezing on the glass. And? Does it work? Sophia smirked, but it lacked any real humor. No. Because the past isn't something you can hide from. It always finds you. He nodded slowly, as if her words touched something inside him. A flash of lightning outside the window briefly illuminated his face, revealing a sorrow buried deep within. Maybe we're not running from the past itself, but from its consequences, he said softly. From memories that refused to let go. They fell into silence, both lost in their own thoughts. It felt like their conversation was part of something bigger, something they had yet to understand. You know, Trevor suddenly said, studying his glass as if it held all the answers. Sometimes it feels like the storm inside us is much stronger than the one outside. Sophia nodded. She knew that storm, knew how it could consume, pull under, drown. But even storms pass, she said, watching his face. The key is to find the shore. Trevor smiled slightly, but there was more sorrow than joy in it. Sometimes the shore is just another place to run from, he murmured. His hands trembled slightly as he raised his glass to his lips, and Sophia saw the pain in his eyes, the pain he wasn't ready to share yet. She didn't press. Instead, she just stayed, letting the silence fill the gaps. From that night on, they started meeting more often. Walking along the waterfront, they listened to the waves crash against the shore, each time feeling their shadows dissolve into the night. Sometimes they talked about random things, about cities they had never been to, about books they would never read. But most often they just stayed quiet. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Rather, it was a rare moment of truth, where neither had to hide their pain or fears. Sophia found herself feeling an odd sense of peace around him, as if the very idea of loneliness was losing its grip on her. Trevor, in turn, sometimes looked at her in a way that made her feel like she was something he had been searching for, yet feared to admit. One evening, during one of their silent walks, he suddenly stopped, staring at the horizon. If you could be anywhere right now, where would you go? He asked, not turning to her. Sophia thought for a moment. Somewhere no one knows me. Where I can start over. Trevor nodded, a faint smile ghosting his lips. Then we're more alike than I thought. It was more than just a habit now, it was salvation in each other's eyes. Their connection was fragile, yet it pulled them together, despite the fears and wounds they weren't ready to name. Trevor never spoke to Sophia about his past. It lingered between them like a shadow cast by the moon over stormy waters. He avoided questions and she didn't press, though with each meeting, she felt something inside him was fracturing. She discovered the truth by accident. One evening, when he left his jacket draped over a chair, Sophia instinctively reached out to move it. But something firm, folded inside the pocket, caught her attention. With trembling fingers, she pulled out an old, time-worn letter. The ink had slightly blurred, but the words were still readable. Spoke of a girl. Someone he had lost. Sophia's heart clenched. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the aged paper. Her eyes locked on the lines that seemed to scream in silence. Who was she? Why had Trevor never mentioned her? Sophia knew she had no right to read further, as if she was peering into someone else's forbidden pain, but something inside her whispered. This fragment of the past mattered. It explained what she had long struggled to understand. She slowly lifted her head, her breath hitching, heart pounding too loudly in her chest. Her throat went dry, and an icy sensation spread through her. This was the moment where reality could crack and shatter. "What is this?" Her voice was quieter than she expected, almost breaking into a whisper as she held up the letter. Trevor flinched as if caught in a sudden gust of wind, then slowly closed his eyes. His fingers curled involuntarily, as if trying to grasp something slipping away. Sophia saw the tension in his jaw, the way he took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into freezing water. He seemed to be battling himself, deciding whether to tell the truth or retreat behind the walls of silence he had spent years building. "A part of me," he whispered, his voice rough, as if the words scraped against him, peeling him open. "One that I can't let go, even if I wanted to." He opened his eyes and looked at her as though pleading for understanding, yet at the same time fearing her judgment. In his gaze was something painfully raw: fear, guilt, an unrelenting attachment. As if he had long been trapped in the past, unable to find his way out. There was bitterness in his voice, but also something else. The exhaustion of someone who had carried the weight of memories for too long. Sophia felt her fingers tighten around the letter, as if trying to absorb the story hidden in its lines. "She was important to you?" she finally asked, but her voice betrayed her, shaking slightly. She already knew the answer, knew it before she even asked, but for some reason she needed to hear it from him. Maybe to confirm her fears, maybe to search for some hint that they were unfounded. Trevor let out a bitter laugh and ran a hand down his face. "She was everything," he admitted, his voice quiet but thick with emotion. "And maybe she still is. Sometimes I think that if I let her go, I'll lose a part of myself. As if without her, I'm no longer me." His words cut through Sophia like shards of ice. She felt something inside her break, something she hadn't yet named. There was so much love and pain in his voice that she was suddenly terrified. Was she merely an echo of his memories? A way to fill a void that could never truly be filled? And if that was true, could she live with that? She wanted to say something, to find the right words, but instead she remained silent. Because sometimes silence spoke louder than any question. That night she dreamt of nightmares. In them the lighthouse swayed over the raging water, and Trevor called out a name that wasn't hers, over and over. Sophia didn't know if it was jealousy or fear. The fear that she would never be able to claim the space in his heart that already belonged to the ghost of his past. Days passed after her discovery. Sophia began to notice changes in Trevor. He withdrew more often, lost in thoughts as if something unseen haunted him. He avoided long conversations, sometimes responding in single words, and at times it seemed like he was far away, detached from reality. One night, he took her to an old oil platform abandoned years ago. The wind howled between the metal structures, rusted beams creaking as if protesting against the storm's force. Shadows fell across the iron staircases, creating the illusion of movement, as if those who once worked here still wandered its corridors. The place felt alive in its own eerie way, holding forgotten stories, distant footsteps, and unheard voices. A chill ran down Sophia's spine. The air was thick with salt, oil, and something else, something nearly imperceptible, yet deeply unsettling. Her heart pounded faster, and her steps unconsciously slowed. She looked at Trevor. His face remained focused, but his gaze betrayed tension. She sensed that this place was more than just rusted metal to him. It meant something. "The silence helps here," he said, staring into the darkness. His voice was hollow, as if the very air swallowed his words, refusing to let them escape. At that moment Sophia realized his past bound him, like heavy chains preventing him from moving forward. She studied his face. His jaw was tight, lips pressed together. The dim glow of a lone lantern hanging over the entrance to a deserted hangar cast sharp shadows on his features, making them look even more angular. His eyes reflected not just darkness but something unresolved, as if he fought unseen demons that pursued him even here. His jaw tensed, and his fingers curled into a fist, as though restraining something that refused to let go. "Are you afraid?" His voice was unexpectedly quiet, nearly indistinct, but something in it sent a shiver through her. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a confession, and perhaps a warning. The wind swept through the metal structures, making the platform let out a long drawn-out creak like a weary sigh. Sophia grasped his hand, feeling the icy wind seep through her clothes, yet his warmth was the only thing grounding her at that moment. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't let go, even as he held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "Not with you," she whispered, and it was more than just words. It was trust, a promise, but maybe also self-deception. For a brief moment, his fingers tightened around hers, as if searching for something deeper than mere reassurance. Maybe redemption. Maybe proof that he wasn't completely lost. His breath hitched, and for a second, she felt he wanted to say something more, but instead, he merely lowered his gaze, retreating once again into silence. They wandered through the rusted staircases, each step making the metal groan beneath their weight, as if resenting their presence. Trevor had said this place made his thoughts clearer, yet his voice carried no relief, only the weight of realization. He ran his fingers along the railings, testing their strength, but in truth, he was seeking an anchor amid the storm within. "Sometimes I hear her voice here," he admitted, not looking at Sophia. His words hung between them, dissolving into the night air filled with the echo of waves and the whisper of wind. Whose voice? Her own voice was barely audible, yet it carried a quiet insistence. Sophia's heart clenched, her grip tightening on the railing, as if she needed to hold on to this fragile moment. She didn't want to hear the answer, but at the same time, she knew it would change everything. He took a deep breath, hesitating for just a moment, as if preparing to cross an invisible line. His gaze was filled with ghosts of the past, memories that refused to let go. Under the dim light, his face looked even paler, and his eyes held the weight of secrets long kept buried. Her. He exhaled the word, as if uttering a name he feared to speak. "The one I couldn't save." Sophia froze. The wind whistled through the corroded pipes, like a distant whisper. She suddenly felt as if they were not alone. Or was it just her imagination? Trevor leaned against the railing and closed his eyes. "It's easier to hear her here," he murmured, "like she's still alive, waiting for me to remember something important." A strange mix of jealousy, unease, and fear stirred within Sophia. She didn't know who this woman was, but she felt her presence in every one of Trevor's glances, in every moment of his silence. "Have you ever tried to let her go?" she asked. Trevor slowly opened his eyes. "What if she won't let go of me?" His voice carried exhaustion. Sophia turned away, staring into the darkness. She didn't know what hurt more, realizing she might only be a shadow among his memories, or understanding that he was trapped within his past, unable to escape. In the distance, a rusted metal beam groaned, as if the platform itself responded to their conversation. Sophia shivered. "We should go," she said quietly. Trevor nodded, but he didn't move. He was still staring into the darkness, as if waiting for someone to step out of it. "Yeah," he finally replied. "But something tells me this place hasn't let me go yet." They left, but the feeling of unseen eyes watching them never faded. One day, Trevor disappeared. No explanations, no notes. Only his watch, left on the bedside table, like a forgotten fragment in the chaos of his thoughts. Sophia ran her fingers over the glass face of the watch, holding her breath. He had always worn it. He never took it off. Something inside her tightened with a painful premonition. She searched for him all over the city, running through familiar streets, peering into the shadows of alleys. At the pier, she stood for a long time, staring into the dark waters, as if hoping to see reflections of answers. The wind tore through her hair, whispering anxious thoughts she tried to silence. "Have you seen Trevor?" she asked in the bars they used to visit together, but no one had an answer. Bartenders only shrugged, regulars turned away, lost in their own worlds. It was as if Trevor had dissolved, vanished, leaving behind only her confusion. With each passing day, his absence became more tangible, as if the city itself was slowly erasing him from its memory. Doors they had once opened together were now closed. Streets they had walked felt unfamiliar. Sophia caught herself walking more quietly, as if afraid to disturb something unseen. Nights became unbearable. She woke from nightmares in which he stood at the edge of a cliff, staring into the void, never turning back. Sometimes she heard his voice, faint, distant, as if reaching her from another reality. Sophia. But as soon as she woke, only silence remained, thick, suffocating, filling every corner of the room. Her fear turned to despair. She thought about everything he had hidden, about the ghosts of his past that refused to let him go. Had they been the reason for his disappearance? Or had he left deliberately, escaping from her? A week passed, filled with sleepless nights and anxious waiting. Sophia didn't know what was worse, the lack of news or the gnawing premonition that something terrible had happened. But when her phone lit up with a strange message, a chill ran through her. Coordinates. No name, no explanation. Just dry numbers leading to a place long forgotten. An abandoned cemetery near the old church. A place where the dead past merged with the present. Sophia's heart stopped. This wasn't just an address. It was a challenge. She knew she had to go. Even if the truth she found there would change everything. She arrived late in the evening, when the fog curled around crooked tombstones, and the dim glow of the street lamp revealed only fragments. Cracked inscriptions on stone, shadows spreading across the ground like living entities. And then she saw him. Trevor stood deep in the cemetery, half hidden by the church wall, submerged in darkness. He looked ghostly, exhausted. His shoulders were tense and his eyes, deep and dark like voids swallowing the light. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction, as if he was saying it not to her, but to himself. Sophia stepped closer, but he didn't move. Anxiety tightened around her, knowing the truth was now so close. "But I came," she replied, meeting his gaze, "because I can't be without you." Trevor closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to escape her words, but then exhaled heavily. "I was afraid you'd say that." "Why?" Her voice trembled. He ran a hand down his face, trying to hold himself together, but it was clear. He was breaking. "Because I don't know if I can protect you from this," he said, lifting his gaze to her, full of shadows. "From me." Sophia stepped closer, her fingers trembling with tension. "Did you leave the coordinates?" she asked. He nodded. "Then why did you tell me not to come?" Trevor let out a bitter chuckle. "Because some secrets should stay buried." She froze. Something in his voice, in this place, in the way the light flickered across his face, told her that ahead lay something far greater than just a memory. "But you still led me here," she said quietly. "That means some part of you wants me to know." The wind rose, carrying the cold scent of damp earth. Trevor slowly nodded. "Maybe. But once you know the truth." He hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "There's no turning back, Sophia." He stood there like a stranger, and for the first time admitted that he couldn't love her because he still hadn't let go of the past. His face was pale in the dim glow of the street lamp, and his shadow stretched long, as if reaching for her but unable to touch. "I can't love you the way you want me to," he whispered, his voice filled with pain. "She's still here inside me." Sophia felt her breath catch. Words stuck in her throat, too heavy to speak. She saw his fists clench, as if he was fighting himself, wanting to say more but afraid of shattering what little remained between them. "Trevor." Her voice trembled as she stepped closer, but he didn't move. His eyes, cold, dark, yet filled with something she couldn't decipher. He looked like a man lost in the labyrinth of his own memories, unable to find the way out. "I know," she finally whispered. "But I'm still here." She reached out, but he didn't take her hand. Instead, he turned his gaze away, his shoulders trembling slightly. Whether from the wind or the pain tearing him apart, she couldn't tell. "Sometimes love isn't what saves us," he said. "Sometimes it's what keeps us trapped." Sophia felt the sting of tears welling in her eyes, hot and relentless. She clenched her fingers into a fist, trying to hold on to something intangible, but she already knew the battle was lost. An emptiness spread inside her, filling every part of her being. "That's not true," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "That's fear." Trevor slowly lifted his gaze to hers. For a fleeting moment, something like hope flickered in his eyes, but it vanished just as quickly, like a dying flame. "And if I can't let go?" His voice was barely audible. Sophia stepped even closer, on the verge of breaking but refusing to let herself fall. "Then I'll stay until you can," she said. And in those words was a truth he was too afraid to accept. Trevor said nothing. Around them the wind howled, dry leaves rustling in the air, and only their breath cut through the shadows and light. She knew he needed time, but she feared that one day he would disappear again. And yet she couldn't leave. After that conversation at the church, silence hung between them. It wasn't heavy, just tired. Sophia and Trevor decided to meet at the old pier. The water was dark and endless, reflecting the gloom of their thoughts. The sky was shrouded in thick clouds, with only occasional flashes of lightning tearing through the endless veil. "Let's sail far away," Trevor suggested, his voice quiet but resolute. He gazed at the water as if, deep within it, lay the truth he so desperately sought. Sophia looked at him. Was there a flicker of hope in his eyes, or had she only imagined it? Her heart clenched with unease. There was something more in his words than just the desire to escape reality. "You know the water won't wash away the past, Trevor," she said, stepping closer, feeling the cold raindrops strike her face. He nodded, then wordlessly stepped into the water, as if testing his limits, his right to disappear. Sophia followed, and the icy water pierced her skin, stealing her breath. They swam side by side, listening to the depths whisper stories of those who had once sought salvation here too. "Why did you want me to come here?" she asked when they stopped at the boundary between darkness and light. Her voice was barely audible, but she knew he would hear. Trevor remained silent for a moment before taking a deep breath. "Because it's easier to forget who you are in the water," he admitted. "Easier to feel like part of something greater." Sophia ran her fingers along his wrist, feeling the cold tremor of his skin. "And do you want to forget?" Her voice was soft but firm. "Sometimes," he answered. "But right now I'm afraid." For the first time she heard this confession. The water surrounded them, endless and silent. Yet in this moment, they felt closer than ever. "I'm afraid," she whispered, feeling his hand tighten around hers. "Me too," he replied. And in that moment, she understood that they were both searching for something they couldn't quite grasp, salvation in each other. "Sophia." His voice was warm but laced with fear. "What if I can't come back?" She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, dissolving into the falling rain. "Then I'll find you wherever you are." They both knew they were running from the truth, but they also knew that one day they would have to stop. It was late autumn when the nights grew longer, and the cold wind crept through clothing, leaving only shivers and unease in its wake. The city had already plunged into darkness, rare streetlights casting dim glows on the wet asphalt. In the distance, the hum of passing cars could be heard, but it felt as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. "Let's leave together, leave everything behind, start over," Sophia blurted out, her voice trembling, but her eyes burning with desperation. "We don't need this past. It won't follow us like a shadow with every step. We can be free, Trevor. Just say you're ready." But Trevor remained silent. His gaze was filled with sorrow, not hope. In it, Sophia saw the exhaustion of a man who had fought for too long, only to surrender in the end. His eyes reflected every storm that raged inside him, every regret that weighed down his heart. He looked like someone who had already made a decision but was still in pain over saying it aloud. "You can't save me," he said quietly, his words sounding like a sentence. His voice was low, breaking, almost a whisper, but Sophia heard far more than just rejection. It was fear, pain, guilt. He wasn't only speaking to her. He was speaking to himself. The wind swept raindrops from his hair, turning them into cold streaks on his face, but Trevor didn't move, as if the rain was the last thing he could still feel in this world. Sophia froze. She felt the pain twisting inside her, fear constricting her chest. She wanted to respond, to say that love wasn't about saving, it was about moving forward together. But Trevor was already stepping back. The rain pounded against the ground, erasing the line between tears and water. "Why won't you even try?" she asked, her voice full of anguish, her fists clenched as if that could keep him from leaving. Tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't asking for the impossible. Just a chance, just an attempt to break free from the endless shadow of the past. Trevor slowly shook his head, and in that small motion, there was more sorrow than words could hold. His lips quivered, but he couldn't find the strength to smile. It seemed like he wanted to say more, but knew that any explanation would only hurt her further. "Because I'm lost, Sophia." His voice was hollow, empty in a way that nothing could fill. "I tried. Believe me, I tried. But there are things that can't be fixed. I don't want you to live among these ruins with me. You deserve more." He took another step back, rain running down his face, but he didn't wipe it away, accepting that it was too late to fight. She watched as he disappeared into the night, his silhouette merging with the darkness. Her chest tightened with sharp pain, her breath caught, as if something vital was slipping away, leaving her alone in the cold rain and empty streets. Sophia clenched her fists, but it brought no relief. She wanted to turn back time, say different words, find a different path, but deep down she knew he had made his choice. "Trevor," she whispered into the void, but the night gave no answer. Only the distant roll of thunder and loneliness, cold and endless, like this city without him. Sophia tried to let him go, but thoughts of Trevor haunted her. His image appeared in the shadows, his voice whispered in the wind, and his touch still lingered on her skin. She didn't know how to stop waiting, how to stop hoping that one day he would return. One night, as the city drowned in neon lights and the scent of rain, she stepped into the bar where they once sat together. The bartender recognized her but said nothing, only nodded as he slid a glass of amber liquid toward her. Sophia stirred the ice absent-mindedly, her thoughts heavy, until quiet voices from a nearby table caught her attention. "His wife died at that lighthouse," one of the old men whispered, his voice rough, burned by years of cigarette smoke. Sophia held her breath. She didn't move, but inside, every fiber of her being tensed, clinging to every word. "Fell straight into the storm," another sighed. "Since then he goes there every night. Stands at the edge, like he's waiting for something or someone." Her fingers tightened around the cold glass, the ice clinking against the sides. Something inside her snapped. This truth struck harder than she had expected. She remembered the way he looked at the waves, how his eyes carried something distant, unreachable. Now everything made sense. He had never truly belonged to her. His heart, his thoughts, his pain had always been tied to someone else, to the one he lost. She had been nothing more than an illusion, a fleeting escape that failed. Rising from her seat, Sophia left money on the counter and stepped into the night. The rain embraced her, mixing with her tears, but she didn't wipe them away. Now she knew the truth. But why did it hurt even more? She returned to the lighthouse where it all began. The rain pounded against the glass, drumming hollowly on the metal frame. But now Sophia knew it was time to let go. The wind was cold, piercing, as if nature itself was trying to erase everything that had happened here. She ran her fingers over the damp stones, staring at the raging waves crashing against the cliffs. It felt like the sea had taken all their unspoken words, their unfinished confessions. In her hands, she held a letter she had rewritten countless times, torn apart, started over. There was no blame in it, no bitterness, only raw pain and forgiveness. "Goodbye, Trevor," she whispered into the night air, her voice lost in the howling wind. She knelt down, carefully tucking the letter beneath a large stone at the lighthouse's base. She wanted to believe that one day he would find it, that he would read it, that he would understand how deeply she had loved him, how hard she had fought for him. But her fight was over now. Sophia rose and took a step back, casting one last glance at the stone. Her chest felt empty, but in that emptiness, there was a strange kind of freedom. As she walked away, her silhouette dissolved into the mist, merging with the rain and the darkness of the night. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to let go and step into the unknown. Years passed. Time didn't erase the memories, but it softened them, turning them into something like old photographs, faded yet cherished. Sophia lived a different life now, far from that lighthouse, far from those cold nights when the wind knew her pain. She met someone new. He was kind, warm, real. There were no shadows of the past in his eyes, only the light of the present. They walked along the shore, their footprints vanishing in the sand, but there was no sorrow in it, only a quiet ease, a realization that she no longer had to hold on to ghosts. Sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when the sunset painted the sky in deep hues, Sophia still thought of Trevor, of how love could be both powerful and impossible at the same time, not with pain, not with longing, just as something that once was and had changed her forever. They sat on the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore. Her companion took her hand, his fingers lightly reminding her that she was no longer alone. "Are you happy?" he asked, searching her face with quiet sincerity. Sophia looked at the ocean, endless, mighty, and suddenly realized that she no longer felt the weight of the past. It was behind her, in a chapter she had finally been able to close. She was free. She smiled genuinely, effortlessly, in a way she hadn't in a long time. Yes. Now yes. Perhaps love wasn't always about happiness. Sometimes it was about learning how to let go. Subscribe to the channel, and hit the like button, so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.